Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and today I wanted to talk about a profile of Slavoj Žižek that was published recently by the New Statesman titled Slavoj Žižek's War with the Left. A somewhat dramatic title that actually reveals itself to be a somewhat sympathetic profile of Žižek in his hometown and essentially sketches a picture of Žižek's life as it is today. But unusually, at least unusually for Žižek, he also reveals some insights into his own upbringing and his relationship and private life. And so I thought it might be worthwhile talking about this article, and of course I would encourage you to read it as well. Žižek himself once said that he was obsessed about Lacan's personal life. Like, he wanted to know everything about Jacques Lacan. And in this sense, I think Lacan is a bit of a master figure for Žižek. And it's no surprise, of course, that Žižek's main mentor in all things Lacanian was Jacques-Alain Miller, himself the son-in-law of Lacan. And the article seems to allude to the fact that Žižek met Lacan at least once, but it doesn't really give any details, which I think is quite interesting. In fact, it says that Žižek was approached by Miller to become a psychoanalyst himself, but Žižek laughed at the idea, saying that the idea that he could listen to somebody talk for any amount of time without wanting to speak himself was totally alien to him. In fact, one of the interesting things about this article, I think, is that it somewhat pseudo-pathologizes Žižek, and by which I mean that it gives you some insight into some tells of his childhood upbringing that I think reveal something about his character. In fact, there's a wonderful scene in the article in which Žižek talks about his father, who he describes as a somewhat boring, oppressive man. And he says that his father, who was a bureaucrat, would come home and put his feet up and demand of the young Slavoj that he untie his shoelaces and take off his shoes. And perhaps the most telling detail is that the father would say to Slavoj, "Tell me something interesting," or "Tell me something amusing." Like, he wanted to be amused in a sort of petit bourgeois way. And it's of course easy to say that this was the original trauma that made Žižek become such a talkative philosopher, etc. But it's a interesting little scene, I think, nevertheless. He also talks about his mother, no memories of her from his childhood, but instead the very difficult scene of watching her slowly pass away in the hospital and having to bribe one of the hospital staff to get her a better room. And Žižek says that one of the things that was so vulgar about this experience was that instead of making it seem like the bribe wasn't really there, the officer, the hotel worker simply accepted the bribe all too readily. The doctor knew exactly how the system worked and upgraded her. And Žižek said that there was something humiliating about this supposed transparency. And I think one of the things that this article shows is that Žižek's sort of restlessness, his mind that kind of takes everything in, is still going very strong. There are certain ways in which he's become somewhat besieged by the left, which is understandable, I think, considering some of his polemics recently. In fact, Žižek says that he actually regrets a lot of his political work. He calls it political shit. Like, what he really wants to focus on is his philosophy. In fact, he says that what gives him hope is that there is still an audience and a readership for the more serious work. But in a sense, Žižek also knows that his tendency to polemicize is also what makes him attractive to a lot of people. And so I think the article gives you an interesting picture of Žižek, the philosopher, who is also, to some extent, Žižek, the clown. And by that, I don't mean that Žižek is a clown, but that there's an image of him that circulates as a clown-like, court jester-like figure that I think puts Žižek in a double bind, because on the one hand, it makes him popular, it makes him very accessible, but at the same time, it kind of like reduces his philosophy to a certain caricature. A caricature that became almost a meme and that became especially prominent on right-wing media circles. And so Žižek says that now he finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's not lamenting it necessarily. I mean, he said before that for him, a work of writing for him is only successful if it manages to alienate the left and the right equally. But at the same time, you can see that there's a certain bitterness that has crept in. The infamous endorsement of Donald Trump led to a rift between him and The Guardian newspaper, and the essay even the profile even hints at the fact that Žižek is no longer on speaking terms with the Žižek Studies research group, which is sort of its own irony. In fact, one of the revealing aspects of this article is that it finally sheds light on the true nature of the infamous Žižek Substack. Some of you may have noticed that there is a Substack that is purported to be in Žižek's name, that has been releasing writing and paid writing. It's a subscription platform for quite some time now, and nobody really knew who was running it. And this article reveals that it is in fact Hanif Qureishi's son, Caro, who is essentially the mediator who posts things there for Žižek. And so the article suggests that Žižek's income right now is mostly derived from his Substack, but it doesn't go into details, of course. It also sheds, I think, a little bit of light on his relationship with Jela Krecic, which from the videos I've seen online seems very charming and very sincere and very intellectually enriching. And it depicts a kind of unusual routine. The article leads by saying that she goes to bed at 4 a.m. and is a heavy chain smoker. And so she wakes up by the time that Žižek is already awake and has done groceries and made breakfast, etc. But vice versa, when he's tired and wants to go to bed, that's when she starts revving up to sort of do the work that she wants to be doing. And it sketches this very, very charming, to my mind, intellectual life of two people who are very engaged in their own work and hopefully also stimulating each other. So that was a little tidbit that I enjoyed. In part, what makes this article enjoyable is that it kind of reveals Žižek in his mundane day-to-day reality. It demystifies his figure somewhat. And so it's little things, like having to go to the hospital. It sheds some light on his heart condition, that he has heart palpitations, suffers from diabetes, etc. And it kind of humanizes Žižek in a little bit without vulgarizing him, which to say it humanizes him not by trying to depict him as the saintly figure, but instead it shows us in a very Žižekian way, simply Žižek in his most vulgar, grotesque, humane form, which I think, for those of you and us who are interested in his work and life, I think is of interest. In fact, I think I want to add one thing. One interesting irony about this article is that one person who actually speaks favorably about Žižek, who is cited as essentially saying nice things about him, is none other than the English philosopher John Gray, which is somewhat ironic considering that John Gray once wrote a scathing review of Slavoj Žižek's book Less Than Nothing, characterizing it as amounting itself to less than nothing. John Gray is one of the most vocal critics of Slavoj Žižek's work, and yet he actually expresses himself in fairly generous terms about Žižek. And part of the reason for this is that now that Žižek finds himself in conflict with what you might call the left or the various factions thereof, etc., John Gray is more sympathetic to Žižek. John Gray himself having written multiple books, including most recently in which he attacks the left and also liberalism. If you're interested in John Gray's work, some of it is quite interesting. Some of it, I think, is unnecessarily provocative. In this sense, he resembles a more austere Žižek. But Žižek really resists this notion of the professor. He says, don't come to my house, you'll find nothing there. There's no tweed jackets and pipes and stacks of books, etc. Like, Žižek is still very much himself. There's a scene in which he's accosted by a member of the public who essentially begins to argue and fight him verbally. There's the discomfort of being approached by young men who essentially idolize him and want to take pictures, and the journalist says that Žižek sort of resorts to a caricature of himself, making somewhat obscene jokes and being even a little bit misogynistic. That Žižek is constantly walking this line between Žižek, the philosopher who simply wants to be left alone to read his books and to write about Hegel, versus Žižek, the public figure, Žižek, the clown, Žižek, the court jester. And that part of the sort of double bind, if you will, of Žižek's existence is that what makes him popular is that he's accessible and polemical, and that he's become a little bit of a meme almost on less mainstream media. But at the same time, his overall body of work, his instincts, remain very theoretical and dedicated to a project of emancipation and revolution. In this sense, Žižek likes to characterize himself as a conservative communist. He actually reiterates this in the piece. A conservative communist who is dedicated to communism to the point that it brings him into conflict with the left. And it doesn't really engage too much with his, disagreements with the left as such. In fact, I don't think that there is even such a homogenous bloc as the left. And so certainly it doesn't really talk about that. But it does paint a picture of a Žižek who is entering into what might be the last stage of his life, the last chapter of his life. He's in his mid-70s, remains very productive, but also increasingly isolated. A Žižek who would like to be remembered, above all, for his theoretical work, and who is less interested in talking about his politics. And so I thought this was actually a very generous piece. I thought it was well thought out. I thought it was well executed. I really hope that you'll take a look at it. It's called Slavoj Žižek's War with the Left in the New Statesman. I'll link it below. Thank you.